Hello, all. This is Dr. Dave Maslach talking to you about reciprocity.com. The E is written with a 3, and in this particular video, I actually want to talk about managerial risk-taking. I'll kind of define what it is. I'll briefly define what it is, and then get into an interesting topic that I find interesting that I've been struggling with for years now. And this is the sort of context dependentness that managerial decision-making and risk-taking takes depending on what way you're looking at it, whether you're looking at it as an entrepreneur or whether you're looking at it as somebody that is very concerned about safety or critical conditions or critical situations. There is often sort of a trade-off that happens there. So, if you don't know who I am, I'm actually a professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship, and this is something that comes up all the time. And it was really actually a leading reason or sort of a thought process in terms of creating reciprocity.com. The E is written with a 3. And that is thinking about managerial risk-taking and thinking about innovation. There's lots of stuff that we can't necessarily get at and we can't necessarily tap into because regular organizations, they are, we can't sort of look at individuals within regular organizations. They're kind of in a unique situation because we sort of study them from afar. But, as somebody that actually studies innovation, there was this really cool thing that's been happening within the software industry, and that there's been sort of this revolution of A/B experiments. So I actually wanted to create a platform that was really useful for a lot of people that can sort of solve their problems, but then as well allow people eventually, it's not at this moment, to sort of do A/B experiments in the background to sort of see how risk-taking changes or, different decision-making variables change when we do these A/B experiments. Now, this is a long ways away currently at this moment, and obviously any sort of experiment has to be vetted by the institution, by any university. I'm very ethical with all this kind of stuff. In fact, I probably err on the side of being probably too conservative. However, it's something that comes up, and this is really related to managerial decision-making, right? So, or managerial risk-taking. So what is risk-taking, managerial risk-taking? Well, that really concerns the propensity that people are willing to choose an alternative that has sort of probabilistic outcomes compared to one that is much more certain. And in general, the evidence suggests, and this is based on sort of experimental stuff within labs, is that most people are going to prefer an alternative if given, two alternatives, one that's a little bit more certain compared to one that's more probabilistic, that has, you don't know what the chance of that thing happening is, right? So you have a kind of an expected value of what it's going to be, but you don't necessarily know what the chance of that thing happening. You're going to choose the one that's more certain. So, for example, somebody walks up to you, a hypothetical person walks up to you and they say, I'm going to give you 50 cents. And instead they say, well, I'm going to give you 50 cents, or you can choose to take this other gamble over here, which is I'll give you $1, but half the time, if I roll the dice, if it's less than 3, then you're not going to get your money. And if I roll this dice and if it's greater than 3, then you're going to get your money. So it's a 50-50 chance that you're going to get your money of $1 versus taking the actual 50 cents. And it turns out that almost everybody's going to take the 50 cents compared to the sort of probabilistic, the risky alternative over here. And in general, there's a strong preference for sort of the certain alternative compared to the uncertain, or the risky compared to the risky alternative. And this is a really interesting phenomenon. And there's lots of people trying to study this within organizations. I'm one of them that sort of thinks about this. And one of the contexts that I've been thinking about is learning from failure and how managers and entrepreneurs, innovators actually perceive learning from failure. So if you think about this, actually one sort of the entrepreneurs people, the people that sort of study entrepreneurship, or the people that, you just listen to any sort of popular press, they're going to say, take risks, go out there and get your thing, focus on the particular opportunity, get outside your shell, take that risk and actually jump on that particular thing. that is contrasted to when you're in sort of a safety critical situation, or a situation where managers might actually, that there might be some outcomes or negative outcomes associated with that. So if you think about, maybe it is you are a trader at Wall Street, and then you're encouraged to take risks, but then you take those risks, and it creates a major financial meltdown. Well, it turns out that trader is going to be blamed for the things that they have done, and they're going to say, well, why did you take those risks? Everybody's going to say, well, why did you take those risks? That was unreasonable. But then the entrepreneur who does basically the same sort of thing, they take those same risks and they pursue that kind of thing. And if they flop, people are like, oh, okay, they flopped. But then, at the same time, if they did win, then we're lauded. We sort of say that, oh, that entrepreneur is fantastic, right? The same with the trader. If they are actually doing well, then we're going to say, keep taking those risks. That's actually a good thing to do. But then if something catastrophic happens, then we say that, wow, what are you doing, right? Like that's a bad thing to do. Same within sort of a medical context, the same sort of situation might occur, right? So if somebody comes into emergency room and they need critical care, well, sometimes physicians have to take risks on getting to that critical care. But then, if something bad happens, then we say, well, why did you take those risks, right? Well, that was kind of silly of you to do that. And there's always this sort of trade-off that this kind of stuff happens. It doesn't matter whether you are an entrepreneur or, a physician or whatever. There's always this trade-off that happens in terms of thinking about managerial risk-taking and sort of doing the thing that's very, very conservative over here. And a lot of it actually comes down to, and I think, so there is psychologists that have talked about this. Barron and Hershey in 1988, they have an interesting idea that talked about the outcome bias, and this might resolve some of it in terms of what's going on. So if you think about it, so what an outcome bias is we often make decisions based on if the outcomes were known compared to when they're not knowing. At least that's my sort of spiel or thought on the outcome bias. So if you're thinking about it, and I put a link in the notes. So, the entrepreneur, for example, before they're actually doing that particular thing and they actually are doing risk taking, we say, go do it. But then when they destroy a bunch of value, or, the company goes bankrupt and there's 25 other people that are associated with that company and they all lose their jobs, and we say, why were you doing that kind of stuff? So it's not until the outcome is actually known that we have this bias, and we make decisions based on when the outcome is known compared to when it's not known. And we sort of evaluate it in different ways depending on when it's not known and not known. And so that's something important to think about, and something that I've been thinking about a lot. In particular, compared to this reciprocity project, for example, I really worry about this in terms of perceptions of what other people think about what I'm doing, because the whole tenure process is really just this sort of pure evaluation process, right? So one side is thinking about this, so one side of me is like thinking, well, this could be a really amazing innovative sort of academic tool or something along those lines that lots of people can find useful. So for example, you can get your own proofreading done on this particular platform. But then as well, if there's more users that are using this, then we can sort of, get scientists that really need something like this access to do some of these A/B experiments. And again, all ethically done, sort of vetted through institutional review boards. If you don't know, that's sort of the ethics department at any university within the United States. Just really, really ethically done. This would be a really cool platform that a lot of people can use and lots of people can find very, very useful from many different sides. But then if it flops, or if there's some sort of catastrophic thing that happens, then, I'm to blame. And then people are going to say, why were you actually doing this kind of thing? If it takes off and more users are using it and it becomes a useful tool for people to sort of use from both sides, then people are going to say, oh, that's amazing. Why didn't somebody else do this? And I think a big part of this is thinking about sort of this managerial risk-taking perspective, right? It's really tricky to sort of navigate these particular issues. And so what I'm thinking, in the way that I'm viewing this, in the way that this has kind of evolved, particularly with these YouTube videos in terms of key takeaways, in navigating some of these issues is really, this is what I'm trying to do, is trying to be as open and honest as I possibly can and sort of repeat what my goals are with this particular thing on YouTube and make this sort of known so that later on people can sort of draw upon this and say, you know, that was a complete disaster, or this guy was, you know, what the heck was he thinking, or this was actually a really cool thing. You know, just sort of as a way to document what's going on. And I think that's important to think about that so you can bring people along and sort of document the entire process of what's going on so you can navigate some of these issues in case there is something that happens. And, you know, to be honest, I'm just trying to be, you know, I'm trying to sort of make myself a better person and try to make you a better person of trying to solve this particular issue. But then I often think about this sort of the risk-taking perspective, right? And how people perceive these particular issues or perceive what you're doing when you're doing any sort of risk-taking actions, for example. And then the other thing that you could sort of take forward with managerial risk-taking is to try to compartmentalize as many things as you possibly can. So I've been trying to do this as much as I possibly can. So for example, I try to do these YouTube videos at home to sort of navigate any particular issues if there's sort of, you know, things to do with intellectual property and things like that, to make sure that I have these sort of divides as much as possible, such that if this entire project goes out the window, right, and it's a complete disaster, then it's not going to bring down, you know, my institution, for example, or it's not going to sort of reflect badly on what they're doing, because I want to separate those boundaries as much as I possibly can. And it's important to think about trying to make these things self-contained as much as you possibly can, even though it's really difficult because you're resource constrained and it's tricky to do some of this stuff, but it's also something to think about going forward to try to make things as self-contained as you possibly can, to navigate some of these entrepreneurial issues that everybody that is doing something innovative or entrepreneurial, and that is truly just anybody that's doing anything that's remotely unique, are going to have to deal with these particular issues, is try to make sure that you're open and honest, but at the same time, you know, compartmentalizing as much as you possibly can to make sure that you don't run into any particular issues going forward, because I think it's interesting. So in this video, what I did is sort of talked about managerial risk-taking, defined what it is, and then I went through and sort of talked about this trade-off that happens between managerial risk-taking, depending on the context that you're looking at, whether, you know, it's a safety critical sort of situation or a, you know, entrepreneurial sort of situation or innovative situation, and then talked a little bit about this sort of outcome bias that we might have as evaluators of other people's decisions that happen. And then I went in and talked about possible ways to mitigate at least a little bit of this. And that's all I'm going to talk about in this video. I just think it's a really interesting topic. So if you like this, make sure you give me a thumbs up, and as well, do subscribe to the YouTube channel. I put out stuff every day, or I'm trying to, for at least a year, and then we'll see what goes on after that. So stay tuned. All right, take care. Bye.